and welcome to another episode of Talking About Teaching Economics. My guest today is George Jia. He's a associate professor at the University of Prince Edward Island, does a lot of remote teaching and focusing primarily on intro micro. And today we're going to be talking about teaching international trade in the context of that intro course. But first, George, we were talking before we got on the air here about teaching remotely and how you handle that. Do you want to give us a little rundown on how that works for you?
Okay, so for me, because the main course I'm teaching actually online is the Intro to Micro, so obviously that's going to be a fairly large class. So we capped it at 75 this year, but if we didn't, it can easily go up to like 150 or something like that. And another course I'm also teaching online is Economics of Entrepreneurship, and that one is also capped at like 50 or something. And then again, if we didn't do that, that can go anywhere almost close to like 100 or something like that.
Oh,
So
wow.
for these type of courses, because of the large number of students, I know a lot of people think that have a synchronous course even online would kind of work, but I think it really works well for like 15 to 20 students or even less
Mm-hmm.
than that for synchronous to work, because you do have that almost kind of one-on-one or one to 3 or 4 students kind of ratio, and you can like kind of have a focused question and a back and forth. But once it passed 30 or 40, that just doesn't work anymore. And the other thing I realized is that especially for first year students, I mean, even when we're in person, I mean, the attendance rate was never really high, simply just because there's a large number of, student body in
Mm-hmm.
the class. So people do have this feeling like if I don't show up for one or twice, and then nobody's going to notice. There's that feeling, right? So even in person, let alone if we're online, then you're just, watching a screen. Like, obviously we don't count, how many little screens are actually open. Obviously we can see how many people, but I just don't think it works that well. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of what I do is I record all of my lectures ahead of time. And of course, like I sort of like a rotate and I change from year to year, introducing new examples and stuff like that. But I will make all the things available from day one, pretty much
Oh,
like the entire course there. So anyone can just like go at their own pace. But obviously, like they might not be updated. So what I will do is that I will still go with my schedule. So I'll update each of the lectures as we go along, but you will always have like the previous year's lecture there
okay.
if someone wants to venture, ahead of schedule or something like that. And then that gives them a little bit more autonomy in the way that like, they can really control their own schedule. And then the same thing for my, upper year elective courses as well, like economics of entrepreneurship, same thing. Um, so this way you give them more freedom, but then at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, the thing you have to be really careful is that, especially with asynchronous course, like you can't have students just like falling off the track, and then they don't do anything until the midterm hits. I mean, I think in person you have the same thing, but you want to
Yeah.
avoid that. So what I force them to do is every week there's a homework,
Okay.
every other week there's a quiz. So
Mm-hmm.
in combination, both of these will not ask for more than 45 minutes every other week or so. So it's
Okay.
essentially spend 20 minutes a week. I, finish some multiple choice questions that reflects like what you learned, how to answer this type of questions. And then every other week you have like a mini quiz. But again, that's, focus on to like maybe at the 20 minutes interval, right? So I don't want to take too much of their time so that they're like start complaining. Even with this, they're still complaining because they think it is too much work. But the whole point is that so they don't fall off the track, and then
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like a little, you know, knock box at the background. It's like, hey, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do
Mm-hmm.
this. That pushes them forward as well as it keeps them on track.
Right.
And then of course you want to keep that flexible in the way if someone misses one or just give them cut them slack. Okay, yes, you can always make it up as we go. That's fine.
Right. So what software are you using for the assessment?
For assessments, so we're using MyLab, which is a Pearson
Okay.
product. So they do have very nicely, integrated stuff. Like they have the study aids there, as well
Mm-hmm.
as the quiz tools, the homework tools. So everything is sort of bundled
Right.
together. So again, you want to keep it in one platform so that they're not
Hmm.
distracted, and then they can just click on one link. Oh yeah, so I have homework due this week, and I just finish that right away. So I think Pearson does that really well, especially because
Nice.
it's now integrated into Moodle, which is what our university use as the e-learning tool or platform.
Nice. Great. Great. No, I think that's useful because we've all sort of experimented with this remote delivery model over the last couple of years. And I did it as the live in-person lecture just because if it's happening at a specific time and I wasn't making the recording, that was my kick in the pants to get them to turn up and invest a little bit. But let's get back to the core topic we wanted to talk about today, which was international trade. So when do you cover this in the intro course? Where does it fit for you in the course design?
So I think a lot of us more or less follow a book nowadays for intro. But I think this is a kind of naturally fits in right after you have some of the main topics down. Like you covered a little bit about what is equilibrium, you talk about demand, you talk a little bit about supply. And then I believe the one I'm using is chapter 7 or chapter 6. This is right after something about government intervention in the market. And
Hmm.
right afterwards, you have international trade.
Hmm.
So I think that's a very natural place to put it because now the students understand a little bit more about how the market works, especially because after they think like, oh, the how government like price control or taxes
Right.
work, and then you introduce international trade. And then one of the things that's special about international trade is this is perhaps the first time like for a lot of them to really see what it means to have comparative advantage, right? So
Hmm.
which we obviously mentioned that in chapter 1 or even chapter 3 or chapter 2 of the course case. It's a very important subject in economics and a very important concept for students to understand, but we really don't have that chance to introduce that formally until you hit international trade because it's just
Hmm.
very natural, sort of a theme. Oh, why do we trade? Like, but then this really goes back to the beginning of micro or macro or anything, right? So why do we trade as individual? It's essentially the
Hmm.
same thing. Why we trade between countries, and then but then for a lot of students, I think it's kind of exciting. Like for me, I love teaching this, right?
Hmm.
Especially this chapter is because it's the first time you can see some students. It's almost like an eye opener. Oh, this is how it works. Oh, we don't actually have free trade in Canada. Oh, we don't even have a free trade between provinces in Canada. So it's kind of like those like deeper layers. Oh yeah, we really don't actually, even though we say, oh yeah, we promote free trade because we had NAFTA and now it's like the whatever this 3 country joint agreement, but we still don't have free trade really, right? So
Nice. No, that's great. And so you're teaching it effectively as sort of an extension of demand and supply.
mhm,
So you're using that small open economy model,
right,
but you're also building in a throwback to that Ricardian trade model as
right,
well. Is that fair? No,
that's
that's
fair.
that's
Yeah.
great. I think that's brilliant. So how do you motivate or how do you introduce this topic? So, it sounds like it's going to be a really dry topic. Clearly, you're passionate about it. Um, so what's the hook? What do you throw out there as a hook, or is a sort of an opening line to get their attention?
So I like to use 2 or 3 different examples.
Okay.
One is actually beer. Okay, so
Near and
it
dear to
is
our
one of
hearts.
my yeah, it is one of my favorite example because we obviously don't have free trade in beer. Between U.S. and Canada, obviously there's a border; they stop you and everything. And also, we actually don't have free trade between provinces as well.
Right.
So that cuts into a little bit deeper level because if at least until a while ago, like if you cross the border between New Brunswick and PEI, you can still be technically dinged for bringing more than 2 cases of beer. Means
Hmm.
that we don't have free trade, right? And
Yeah.
also there's other sort of things. So I like to use that and then as opening or just okay, yeah, think about like why is beers so expensive even though you have a lot of variety now, but why is that I can't get beer from BC or so like or from some beer from US? And then the second one is milk, right? So milk is kind of
Mm.
a very good example, or any sort of milk related products as well. So again, because we have the supply management system in Canada that's in place, I mean, we probably already covered that a little bit when we talk about government, right? So we can, oh yeah, milk is like capped at certain, a quota, and you have to spend millions of dollars to buy a quota. And then, so alternatives. So how does that work with international trade? If someone else like France or US can just ship their milk here, and obviously then none of this thing would work. So effectively they have quota, or they have like a really, really restrictive quota as well. So that we talk about trade. So we're talking about, okay, so you want to know why milk is so expensive here? And obviously because PEI is such a agriculture heavily, province. So a lot of kids actually do know quite a bit about milk or milk production, right? So some of them are actually, grew up in farms or even milk farms, right? And then there's this traditional sort of answer, oh yeah, we don't have hormones, we don't add antibiotics in Canada. It's a very restrictive. So, yeah, that's one. But why is Canadian like regular milk more expensive than organic milk in the US? And then they got like kind of almost stunned by that. It's like, no, they're, and then you pull out the data, yeah, they're a little bit more expensive than US organic milk, right, in certain states. So, even the same standards, it's true, right? So, and then that is sort of opener for me, because at least for my students, they care about beer. And let's be honest about this, right? So wine, beer, whatever alcohol, right? So they care perhaps about milk. It's just because we are in such a province that is a very heavily based, milk production. And then again, it cuts a little bit deeper into the layer is that, well, we still don't have free trade in milk products between Canadian provinces because we have different regulations. Because in other provinces, basically milk has to be, filtered or I guess pasteurized, but in Quebec it's not. So sometimes it actually gets really hard to import Quebec cheese. I mean, now it's a little bit loosened up. I think they changed some more regulation, but you still can't get unpasteurized milk from Quebec and then ship it to Charlottetown, start actually selling them. That's still not allowed.
Right. Oh, those are great examples. That's a neat angle. One of the things I've always done is I've done it with clothes, right? And say, look at your friend's shirt. Where was it made? And you never find clothing that's made in Canada.
Yeah, unless you have a bunch of students who are really loaded, then they have a Canada Goose, which is a whole different topic, right? And that's a very good opening too. So, but I think that's when I say, oh yeah, do you guys think like trade is even important for you guys? And then and then you ask them, okay, look at anything on your desk, look at your phone, all right, look at they all have phones, they all have computers now, there's more tablets, or even sometimes the textbooks that's we use are actually technically not Canadian, and then they're printed in the US. And then it's almost anything, like you said, right? Their shoes, their pens, their clothes. I mean, if you think trade is not important to you, just look at the thing that you buy, right? So from the very morning, you drink coffee, perhaps, or tea, or whatever. All right, those are not made in Canada in general.
Nope.
Yeah. So so from get-go, and the buses that we actually ride on, the cars we actually ride on, or even the bikes. And then trade is so important to us, but not a lot of people pay attention to it, of course.
No, I really like that. That's a great opening line. I think I'm going to use that. Is trade important to you? Is international trade important to you? And then get into the example. That's brilliant. You've talked about beer, and you've talked about Canada, US. Are there any countries or specific things that you spend a lot of time talking about in trade, other than the beer or the milk example? I really like the milk example because it links to that earlier concept of supply management and price floors or government intervention. Are there any countries you like to pick on, or examples that you like to go with in that way?
So not necessarily about restrictions, but now maybe about restrictions. The cell phone or smartphones now is a perfect example to talk about international trade. Because if you think about the typical iPhone, it's designed in the US. So the actual planning, most of the profit go to the US because Apple is a California company. But then it's assembled in China, or now as well as in India, right? So over the last 2 years. But then if you look at the scale of things that goes into a phone, I mean, that also teaches about teaches us about how important international trade nowadays is,
Hmm.
because you have chips from Samsung, which is from South Korea, and then sometimes you have screen either from Samsung or LG, which again is South Korea, and then you have the camera module, which is usually from Sony, which is from Japan, and a lot of memory chips are actually from Taiwan. And then you have all these different areas or countries are
Hmm.
actually all focusing on just like one simple product, and then it gets actually assembled in China, like for most
Right.
time, right? And then you can also start talking about trade wars, trade balances, as well as all these things to talk about trade deficit, right? So it has been such an important topic for so long in newspapers. Again, for the average person, they don't really care. Oh yeah, we have a huge trade deficit with China or with Asia or other countries. So why does it affect me? But then when you try to flip the story around, it's like, actually trade deficit are calculated wrong. I always want to use that sentence. It's actually calculated wrong, because when we actually calculate trade deficit, I mean, a lot of economists kind of get confused by this too, right? So we would calculate it essentially when the iPhone, whatever 15 just released, right? So
Right.
that leaves India or leaves the China, port, and then arrives in the US or in Canada. So it has a value. And technically, that's our trade deficit because it was shipped here, right? So, and then what that means, let's say that phone is like, I don't know, $700, let's say, US, right? So that means
Oh, it's on
our
sale.
trade, yeah, our trade, well, I mean, the raw products, not the
All
final
right.
products, right? So we're
Okay.
talking about the actual phone itself. So when it gets shipped to Canada, so it adds about $1,000 of our trade deficit right away because it was
Hmm.
shipped to us. But the reality is that China or whatever Foxconn really just retains about $25 to $30 of of actually
Right.
the assembly cost. So China really just or India retained that $30. And then because again there are components right into it, so there are like camera modules, which again from Japan, from South Korea, from China, from anywhere else, and then also a lot of the chips are from Texas as well. Like this instrument is a big
Hmm.
supplier for Apple as well. So what that really means is that China only, or China or India just retain this $30, but somehow the trade deficit that we recorded is 1,000. That just
Right.
seems nuts, right? So and then there's sometimes referred as the dark hole of international trade. I mean, most trade economists now recognize this. They're trying to change the way, but this also gave the students really a way of just thinking, oh, so maybe some of the data we see or the headlines that we see about trade or about things about how they're stealing all these jobs from us, or we're suffering, like our economy is so bad because we'll buy so many. It gives them that chance to think about. You mean the numbers sometimes do tell a story, but it's not exactly the story you're thinking of, and you have to think
Hmm.
deeply about this. And this is also one way of introducing. Okay, this is why economics is important in the way that even just through a very simple accounting exercise, you can see how all the economic forces are at place. And also, this is how important trade is, because if we all stop trade with each other, or even
Ooh.
if we just increase, tariff by like 30 or 40%, by the way, your iPhone or your Samsung phone or whatever phone you're going to have is going to be a lot more expensive than what it
Yeah.
is right now.
No, that's great. So in doing all this and going through all these examples, do you link do you make the explicit link between the production possibility frontier and that sort of chapter 2 Ricardian trade model to consumer surplus and producer surplus?
Yes, we do. So
Okay.
at least in the textbook, but I'm sort of following, we do think about, there's the international price, and then there's like a domestic price. How do we increase consumer surplus, or where is the surplus being
Hmm.
allocated? And we'll also talk about how producer surplus can be increased for the exporting country and stuff like that. Right. So we do talk about total surplus. So all of these again. So this chapter lying at about 7 or 6,
Hmm.
I believe, right? It's a
Which
perfect.
book are you following? I know them
I'm
pretty well.
actually following the Western book, so
Western book.
the Perkin,
Oh, Parkin. Okay. Yeah,
yeah,
that's I
Perkin and
think
Bate,
6.
yeah,
Yeah,
six
Parkin
or
and
seven,
Bade, I think it's
right?
6.
So again, so the point is that a lot of the dry ingredient has been put before this chapter, right? So
Right.
we talk about how market demand and supply, talked about consumer surpluses, we're talking about how taxes works. So all of those are kind of dry topics, right? So because those are pure
Hmm.
concepts, right? So, and then trade is the one, as well as the government one, right? So right
Hmm.
before this is really one that start tying, those concepts with real life, right?
We're
So you're like,
back to
oh yeah,
reality there.
yeah,
Yeah.
what do you mean by consumer surplus? Why should I care about it?
Yeah.
Well, if you get things that's cheaper, that you gain, right? So
Cool. So when you're doing this, what is, if you could summarize in like, a 30-second elevator ride, what the objective for you in delivering this material is? What is the learning outcome that you're trying to hit?
So I really want them to get the concept of, again, like you said, consumer surplus and the producer surplus for sure.
Right.
But I also want them to see how it can be reallocated because different government policies, as well as
Mm,
what's free trade, why is good. That's always important, and how policies can screw it up or help with it. Right?
okay. And do you talk about winners and losers at all?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
And we clearly identify who are the losers here. Well, so there are always winners and losers in these things, but then again, the concept of you comparing that
Yeah.
total surplus versus someone lost a little bit, but then as long as you explain to them, okay, there will be someone who suffers initially, but then for both countries,
Mhm.
importing and exporting, it's actually better, right? So both countries gain overall. So we're might be hurting someone, initially, right? But then they're basically getting, unfair advantage in a lot of different ways, right? If you think
Right.
about again, so think about the Canadian milk producers. I might get into trouble with this, but think about the Canadian milk producers. They're really gaining a lot, right?
Hmm.
So because we're restricting the production of milk,
Well,
and this is
I
again why
I'll
the
challenge
quota.
you on whether or not the producers are gaining under the supply management system. I don't think they are anymore.
Well, so whoever supplies the capital initially for the
That
$2 million average of
that's where I
quota
was going.
system, yeah,
That's where I was going.
yeah.
The
So
banks get that money. Come on.
the banks are, yeah. So and then it's actually a really hard process to like. It's really hard to start a chicken farm, an egg farm, a milk
To
farm.
get the quotas is
It's
really,
get a
you got
quota.
to
It's
buy
really
them.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're hard, and they're not even out here in Saskatchewan. You think, oh yeah, it's nothing but grain and cows. Now it's really hard to get a dairy quota out here.
Right. Again, so that I believe the average number now has increased a little bit, and now it used to be about around $2 million for the average farm to get quota, like $2 million. That's how much the quota is, not the
Yeah,
actual farm, just
yeah. You
this
haven't even
license
bought a
to
cow
produce.
yet.
No, nothing. And
Yeah.
now I believe it went up like 10 or 15% over the last
It,
2 or 3 years. So
well, they've raised the rates, so that of course the quotas are going to go up. So, okay, you've got these learning objectives, focusing on allocations in part, and on, generating additional surplus, getting outside the PPF, if you like. How do you assess this? How do you know? Because and this is particularly important because of how you're delivering the material asynchronously. How, I can do it in the classroom, and I can look out and I can see, whether they've, given themselves brain damage by falling asleep and hitting their head on the desk. But how do you know that you've hit these marks?
that's a great question. I actually personally, I really don't, right? So
Okay,
we
that's
do
fair.
have ways of accessing them through, oh yeah. So again, we use homework system as well as quiz system from Pearson. I think
Mhm.
this is one of the chapter that perhaps I gave the most graphic questions.
Okay.
Right. So normally a lot of it is concept, right? So define
Mhm.
this, define that. Is this right? Is this round? So it's easier. So this one, I actually gave them more time for the quiz as well. So
Mhm.
because I know there's a lot more concept, which is challenging, but it's also fun, right? So
Mm.
move this line a little bit. Oh, where is the consumer surplus? And how do they gain? And what if they placed like a tariff on this? And I mean, it
Right.
is definitely challenging,
Mhm.
right? So, but if they get it right, then it is teaching them a lot different things, right? So in terms of economics, right? So
There's
especially
a lot.
micro, there's a
Yeah.
lot going around here. So again, so give them some leniency. So for me, homework, I don't, I basically just expect everyone to get 100, Essentially,
Well,
what I
yeah.
do is that you just keeps on trying, especially for the graphic questions. So like you have 3 attempts, you can try 3 or 4 times if you didn't get 100%, right? So you should get 100% if you
Yeah.
try 3 or 4 times, right? So, but then for the quiz, it's always the same. However, I don't think this one is particularly challenging for based on past experience. The one that's sort of challenging is always the one about production cost. So
Yeah.
I think these
Yeah.
2 chapters might be the hardest one to
I
really
did,
grasp, right?
really, you think this one, for me, the other one that's always students get into trouble with is elasticity.
Right. Oh, elasticity, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or sometimes like well, early on they also get into a problem with stuff like think about cross elasticity or think about like complements or
Yeah.
something, right? So they do.
Yeah.
And this one, yeah, oddly, even though I do think it's very involved, right? It does have a lot hard concept in there, and they actually have to pretty much understand everything they have learned so far in
Right.
order to do it correctly.
Hmm.
But I think a lot of them do get it, kind of almost perfect.
Yeah, well,
Almost every single year.
yeah, like you, this is a fun chapter for me to teach, particularly in starting in 2016 when you had Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side and Trump on the Republican side, singing essentially the same song,
Yep.
which I thought was just wild. But the other thing that I think you're right, and you've identified, I'm just going to put a nice little label on it, is there's synthesis happening in this chapter with this concept. You've got to take concepts from 2 or 3 different places and bring them together to do this really interesting and moderately robust analysis. So that makes it a lot
Yes.
of fun.
Yeah, it is definitely a challenging one. I mean, I can see that, and then they might need a bit of help. But again, I'm
Hmm.
still going to say the production cost one, the long run average cost, short run capture, like that one always gets them. I have no idea why. So yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll have to do another one. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
So, what sort of do you have any tricks or stunts that you pull or gimmicks that you use in trying to get this particular combination of things across? Is there the patented George method?
Uh, I don't think I have a particularly unique one. All I
Okay.
do is again, so that's one of the great things with online with asynchronous. So I record all of my examples. I make sure I go through every single example that touches this like tariff up or introducing tariff. And then the good thing about this is that I cut them into short videos, like 5 minutes for each question, and they
Oh,
can play it as many times. Well, again, with always
oh,
because a lot of times it's just like, oh, seeing it in class once, I really didn't get it. But then
yeah,
if you cut it down, not short enough for sort of information, it's almost like YouTube video. They just watch it again. Like I can see how many times some students actually watch them. Some of
right.
them watch like 4 or 5 times, and then you see that they do actually get it right at the end. You see, that's one of the benefit about
Hmm.
teaching a hard, and somehow it could get like fairly repetitive, right? So if you think about the
Mm,
typical trade model, you're just moving, this one line up and down all the
yeah,
time and cutting down, oh, where's this consumer? But then once they can repeat that and try to learn from just that simple repetition, I think that's really, really helpful. And that's
hmm,
one of the major benefit, in my opinion, about, asynchronous teaching
right.
side of online classes.
No, that 5 minute chunk is a
Yeah.
really good idea. That's really clever. I like that. So, thanks, George. This has been great. I'm going to give you the last word. Imagine you've got a new colleague who's never really taught this stuff before. What advice would you give them?
Try to make it interesting and fun. Now it's really, really important for us to grab their interest
Mhm.
because, again, just as your regular life every day now, you have TikTok, you have short videos, everything. So you really want to try to grab their attention from the get-go. So I
Right,
think one of the biggest challenges that we have right now is that if you don't grab their attention within the first 5 minutes, they're gone.
right.
Whether it's live, whether it's
Hmm.
asynchronous or synchronous. So you really need to do that again. So using fun examples, so stuff like they actually know.
Right.
So always use example like I like to use smartphones. I sometimes like to talk about, how TikTok is challenging all these different ones. Well, now you can use ChatGPT, which is, a BARD
Mm,
versus, right? So when you're teaching complements, substitutes, all these different things, use what they actually care about. And
mhm.
then I think the old pizza pop story doesn't really work as well as we think anymore. I mean, for
No.
any, I think as long as like you're there to teach, right? Even if you're new, right? You're obviously very competent. You know all the things. It's just a way of how to deliver this to
Mhm.
them. Just get them something familiar. So think about your teaching. This is actually works perhaps slightly better for people who have kids, right? So because we're always trying, because the story always starts with candy or video games or something like that,
Yeah.
right? So because okay, yeah, this is a lesson, this is how you learn this lesson is by using candy. It's same
Mhm.
for our students right now. I mean, they have too much stimulants for sure. So it is. I think it is becomes our job. I mean, it is their job to pay attention for sure, but it's also our job to try to actually teach it in a fun way. I think that's
Yeah.
important nowadays.
Great. Thanks very much. This has been Talking About Teaching Economics. My guest today has been George Jia of UPEI.
Thanks for having